We're back to Africa, where Malawians will be voting in the country's general election tomorrow. This will be amid dissatisfaction with the country's economy. As the hours count towards the country's presidential, parliamentary and local council elections, local media reports say not many citizens are optimistic much will change. Candidates are competing for votes against a background of cynicism about what might actually change. The country's president, Lazarus Chakwera, has 15 other candidates to contend with. At the time, queues to get fuel could emerge longer than the queues to vote tomorrow. Prolonged shortage in the supply of petrol alongside regular power cuts, a rising cost of living, hunger, poverty, inequality and youth unemployment are parts of frustrations the people complain about. Now, for more on this upcoming election in Malawi, African Affairs analyst Amuda Musigudi joins me on the news. Good to have you join us on Word Now.
Thank you so much for having me, President.
So about 17 contenders, both President Chakwera and Mutharika will square off against each other. They are seen as the leading candidate. And they're squaring off against each other for the fourth time. The third one was cancelled. But when you look at the trajectory of Malawi in the last 4 elections and dispensation, what would you say is at stake in this election?
I think fundamentally is the quality of living of the people and the question of transparency and the integrity of the electoral system in Malawi. Like you rightly said, this is not the first time they'll be squaring up to each other in the polls. You remember in 2020, the two of them squared up, and the then president of America was declared president until the apex court overturned that election and called for a re-election, which led to the emergence of President Chakwera. And now they're squaring up again. And you see, if you place these two personalities side by side, it's a case of failed promises. Now, if you remember when in 2015, when Mutharika was coming on board as president, there was high hopes among Malawians that it was going to bring a new lease of life to the people. But what turned out was that there was a failure of the system, and that was what led to Chakwera coming on board. And when Chakwera was also coming on board, it came with, as usual, the usual all mouths and trousers, promised a million jobs, promised a new lease of life, improved the economy, and 5 years down the line, it is still back, to the same thing. We've had inflation rate jumping up from as low as 8% to 20%. We've also had, although on the face value, a drop in unemployment rate is still single digits, but we know that is as a result of the new model employed by the ILO in terms of determining unemployment. So these are the issues. It's a question of whether you are ready to go back to Egypt or you are ready to forge, and take the risk of the wilderness. And in the case of having to choose between the devil and the devil, it's unfortunate
I quite like the fact that you did not mention the promised land. One of them is wilderness and the other is Egypt. And there is no promised land actually in this conversation. But let's talk about the cancelled 2019 vote, which prompted a change in Malawian electoral law. This election will now be decided by the 50% plus one format, which means that the winner must get more than 50% of the vote. And I'm wondering what the likelihood is that any of the candidates will get a majority.
Well, it should be said. Don't forget that, and I think everyone seems to be brushing aside in this contest, is former president, just Banda, who is also in, the race. Definitely, she's going to cut off the votes of some of them. And, Chakwera is coming into this vote without his former vice president who died in the plane crash, I think sometime in 2022. who is seen as the darling of the young people. So these are two people. It's a case of having to choose between two negatives for me. And I do not see any of them getting absolute majority votes in this election. What will eventually happen is that there will be a rerun, which will now leave Malawians to choose between, 6.5 dozen, between Chakwera and Mokikera in this case, having, in the first process, having screened out all other contestants like, Jesse Banda, amongst others. So I do not see any of them because the stakes are high. You are looking at the Mokikera whose time was not good. But then you know that because Mokikera is no longer the president, the new darling will be better than the old, than the ex. And that's the talk now. So it wasn't that Mokikera did well while in government, but it's a case of, Chakwera, who promised, heaven and earth, did not even give earth, let alone talking about giving heaven.
And both men, if we must say, are hounded by corruption cases. But one of the most interesting developments for me in this election is that Mutharika has selected the former head of the electoral body who oversaw the cancelled 2019 vote as his running mate. Speak to the optics of this and the implication.
Well, it's unfortunate. I think, again, the dynamics of election, particularly in Africa, has been that what we have is a mobocracy that is grandstanding as a democracy. How do I mean? It's a government by the mob that grandstands as a democracy. Yes, government by the majority, but this majority are a mob. Why do I call them a mob? They cannot decipher the left from their right. And I have often advocated that what we need is an informed democracy. A democracy that allows every Tom, Dick, and Harry to vote, knowing full well that these majority have their opinion molded for them by the minority. In fact, I want to make reference to Samira Amir, who calls it, a democratic fraud, where the minority are the ones that shape the opinion. What we have seen here is Mokikera's sins seem to have been forgiven because now you have a Chakwera who has failed the people. And so his sins between 2015 and 2020 no longer matter. In fact, going ahead to even appoint a man who failed as the head of the electoral body as his running mate means that his sins have been forgiven. And whatever sin, in fact, whatever projected sin he may want to commit in future, no longer matter. That's to tell you of the picture of the kind of electorate that we deal with largely in Africa. An electorate who are not informed, who are swayed by emotions, who because of the hatred for them, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if it doesn't mean that he's my friend. But then because he is standing against or standing up to the current president who is seen as having failed the people, then he's seen as the darling of the people, regardless of even if the devil himself is running it. And that is what you see here. So the optics no longer is, the optics here is subsumed in the whole interest of emotion. And that's just the reality.
And we see that as a pattern across the African continent as well, where we have also seen a pattern of anti-incumbent sentiments and wave, whether it's in Senegal, Ghana, Somaliland, Mauritius, and Botswana. We will see what plays out in this election tomorrow, if that wave will continue. Thank you so much for your time.
And let me also quickly.
In 30 seconds.
There's also this whole wave, this wave of anger democracy, where people make decisions based on anger. And when decisions are made based on anger, you can be sure that logic will have to jump through the window. And that's what we are seeing play out. And
we'll see if that plays out tomorrow. The election is tomorrow. We're following that development. Thank you so much for your time, as always. African Affairs Analyst, Amuda Bosibudi.